Welcome back. The focus of the second session is especially about James Joyce, Dubliners as a collection of short stories written by James Joyce, and specifically Eveline by James Joyce, which is the prescribed short story in our syllabus. I would like to tell you, Eveline and separation of Eveline from the collection Dubliners is little difficult. Therefore, I'll be rather focusing on the collection as well, and we'll discuss some philosophical facets Joyce discusses in the story, in the story collection, and specifically how Eveline becomes a story, otherwise a short story, which can be, how Eveline as a short story can be studied for a literary purpose in an examination. That will also be one of the most important expectations of my discussion today. So, Dubliners. If you want, you can take down notes. Otherwise, again, I emphasize the fact that I'm going to send this PowerPoint to you. These are certain common details you have already known, because most of you have done a lot of studies. And but I thought of routinely rather express all these attitudes regarding the term Dubliners. This is published in 1914. 1914. Think about the timeline. What is 1914? What is the developmental era in the world? Tell me whether it is pre-modern, modern, or post-modern. We know the pre-modern era is transformed into modern era after the Victorian era. It had a lot of reasons, right? Example, the knowledge explosion, climatic level of industrialization, and people started disbelieving religion along with the finding of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. They started critically analyzing theory of creation existed in, especially in English territory, and they started, embracing Charles Darwin as a theorist to explain about evolution in a scientific manner. So there we found that people started questioning God, questioning the existence of God as well. So we find the attitudinal change in the world was prominent. That actually remarks kind of a generation cut. Then pre-modern era, if you study your poetry syllabus, you find a lot of pre-modern poems, starting with Elizabethan, metaphysical, age of satire, romantic, and up to Victorian, right? So when you examine them, their color, their appearance, and their attitudes, the perspectives are quite different from modern literature. Okay, so it is important for you to think about this development as well. Just for example, if you study about nature as a shared theme, it's important to think about how nature is presented by romantic literarians, how nature is associated by modern literarians like Robert Frost. Robert Frost's association connected to nature is quite different from perhaps William Wordsworth. So this development should be studied, because in your questions sometimes they ask select poems from different conventions. So it will be supportive for you to know about it, right? So then, Dubliners, published in 1914, means that it is written in the modern era. Modern era usually officiated after 1900. It runs up to 1945 to 50s. Like during this time, we find that the world goes through massive conflicts like First World War, Second World War, and there are some other civil wars and different conflicts especially in Europe, in the world as well. So this is kind of a chaotic time that man got power at the time that they rejected religion, and man rather rejected religion. And man started moving away from religion, believing that he started believing his own egoism. So it can be the reason why we end up with kind of destruction in these nearly 5 decades. So the story's background setting is that place, time, Place is Europe. Time is this. So 1914 means the beginning of the First World War. Okay, beginning of the First World War. Now, this time that he writes a story, the collection, would be the time of brewing of the First World War. He might be encountering a lot of experience regarding the conflicts of the society. He must be rather experiencing how this particular context selected reacts to that. Okay, but in almost all the stories, his focus is not the main conflict went on. What was the main conflict? War. It was not that. It was not that. It was not the political conflict we found in Ireland. You all know that Ireland had kind of very serious political chaos. So, but he's not eyeing on that. He basically thinks about the perhaps hidden human conflicts amidst this particular, um, you know, great conflicts going on. Because basically people focus on the main conflict. Under the main conflicts, how these micro conflicts, human conflicts, appear in Dublin becomes one of his focuses in his collection. Um, yeah, he uses stream of consciousness, unedited chain of thoughts. It is something very important, right? Example, uh, we have edited thoughts and unedited thoughts. So we are much clear about these two. Example, edited delivery and unedited delivery. Example, when your mother asks what happened today and why did you do that, you have kind of edited delivery. Sometimes if you have kind of things to hide, you say, okay, this happened, this happened, this happened. I did not do that. She did that. Like I said, you have editing. You have edited things. On the other hand, suppose that you meet your best friend, you unveil the unedited chain of thoughts, unedited delivery. So which one is much better to understand? Which one is better to understand the exact personality of the person? Second one is extrovert. It tells us a lot. So use of stream of consciousness lets the reader understand more about the characters. Because unedited, I mean, they are given as it is. So it's helpful for us to understand the inner feelings of a person. Then use of epiphany is noted in this collection. Epiphany is sudden realization, sudden coming to light. This is kind of a technique in Dekai Panahe teledrama sort of but further I say it's kind of advanced use of epiphany used in Dubliners. Characters coming to realization, sudden realization. Perhaps they were not in understanding of what had been going on. They come into action with kind of an impulse of understanding. So these are noted in many of the stories in the collection. Arabi, the adolescent boy, Polly Mooney, Mrs. Mooney in the boarding house, and in this story, Eveline. When you read all the stories in the collection, you find epiphany is used in a very creative manner. Yeah. Yeah, mostly that he talks about the paralysis of characters in Dublin. It's kind of biographical, that writers present their stories, write their stories through their biography. Otherwise, it can be semi-autobiographical, if not associated biographies, encountered biographies of people, if not encountered experience, others imagining experience. But here the writer has little association with rather he's connected to Dublin. So they had kind of first-hand experience about Dublin. That he wanted to use it in his aura. He writes them in the story. He wants the world to realize it. He wants the young, otherwise the lower generation to realize what Dublin had been. So it has kind of a didactic purpose as well, kind of informative, educative purpose of this particular collection as well. He wants to educate people, educate youth especially. So I move. In the collection, the writer discusses about certain social issues which were essentially included in Ireland and Dublin's So the first is a sense of stagnation. What is stagnation? Stagnation can be differentiated when juxtaposing movement. Arm stagnated, but other moves. Then sense of stagnation. Example, some people physically move, but their psychology is stagnated. Nowadays, we find the same experience in Sri Lankans as well. Even though we move, our psychology is not moving, right? We are kind of uh, corrupted. I mean, not Malakadakapu sort of psychology is there. We don't get kind of new mood, even though we physically move. So, doubling, I mean, collection of doubliness is one of the best examples to this sense of a stagnation. Now, especially when it comes to Eveline, the character Eveline, and when it comes to Mrs. Mooney, okay, and many other heroic and anti-heroic characters we find in the collection display the qualities of stagnation. Then religion and political conflicts. He does not talk much about the macro-political concepts as I discussed earlier. He discusses about micro-political aspects, basically micro-political aspects, but these political aspects come through the macro-politics in the society. Example, the central politics in Sri Lanka affects the psychologies of individuals in Sri Lanka. So we can't avoid that. So that even though Joyce does not specifically focus on them, specifically mention them as a brand of Irish politics, that he displays about the consequences people get in life. Similar thing is done by Kamala Markandya in the Nectarine. She talks about the consequences, not of the main politics. Then poverty, economic instability, economic inequity of a country, of the geography doubling is presented in this story, connected to many characters, how people struggle, how people try to meet the end of their day. Especially we know that it is man who should earn bread, earn money, but how woman has to work and support the man. Two becomes one of the important topics in the story, especially when it comes to the boarding house. If you have not read that, please read it before your exam. It doesn't take much of your time to read that story. It's kind of interesting story about a mother, single mother, who struggles with a flirt, a daughter, and a thug, the son. Uh, yeah, the husband had been a drunkard, and there was kind of inevitable separation of the family, I mean, husband and the rest of the family. So she becomes a single mother and struggles to find kind of a neat solution for the son and daughter. How she struggles, all these are given in that, and everything happens because of poverty, the economic layer that Mrs. Mooney lived. So in this also we find Eveline, how she becomes a household worker, a supporter, otherwise a runner of a house, and on the other hand, how she becomes a professional woman as well. She has to earn, not only she has to work at home. All right. So when you put all these things together, we understand Eveline is a very good example to show uh, uh, how economic players are presented in the how this story presents economic players of Ireland. Then exclusion of women in society. That's also another important facet. Uh, Women are not considered as important in Ireland. Okay, women were given much, uh, kind of different treatment, and they're considered as kind of subordinated, submissive uh, category in the society. And there we find gender politics created in the society, gender politics revived in the society, and how James Joyce included them in the story can also be noted. And yeah, next is family. We talk about family. We know that family is a unique, a little society. Mostly short story writers take family as kind of micro example, and how it can be an example of the macro example as well. So this is nicely noted in The Glass Menagerie by Tennessee Williams. Their family and the psychologies they share can be macrocosmic about the society, can be a big example, can be an example, micro example, that can be a sample to match with the macro society of America. So family is one of the main focus point of Dubliners. Then we talk about micropolitics, parents, parental politics, gender politics. Sometimes we find two women, one woman over another can also be another example. Now in Eveline, we find others force Miss Hill, Eveline Hill, to marry. And they can rather deflect the psychology of an individual. Such are little levels of politics we identify in a society. Then emancipation, how you emancipate, how youth emancipates. But one special problem that we discuss in this story is, even though youth has an attitude of emancipation, because of the social system, social decorum, um, they are paralyzed. They are firstly psychologically paralyzed. That psychological paralysis moves towards their physical paralysis as well. They are physically too paralyzed. They are unable to move in the society. So that again, I go back to the first point: stagnation inevitably takes place. So these are certain points that I rather highlighted for you to study from the big collection Dubliners. Eveline specifically, the most focused, most anticipated subject area, Eveline by James Joyce. Simply, it's a story of a young teenager who is at the verge of, on the verge of moving from teenage to the next level. And this is kind of victimization of a teenager and dilemma of a teenager, whether to decide this life or the life that she anticipated. So she's unable to choose between these two worlds. So through the characters, through the symbolic characters, the writer presents her dilemma throughout the story, and by the end of the story, that dilemma is transformed into the reader's mind as well. Okay, later we find that, it can be kind of a very common thing for you as well. Okay, example, this society, now we find it in Sri Lanka as well. People tend to leave the country because you have the condition, you have kind of a right to live happily. If this particular condition does not support you, you leave the society, leave that particular society and you move to another society. This is very common in the animal kingdom as well. You see elephants, when that particular society, that particular jungle is not suitable, that environment is not suitable, if it is not providing, so you simply move to another area. It's kind of very common to every living being. So in a very harsh conditions that Eveline moves through, in a very harsh condition, that she meets a person called Frank, and how he rather views kind of a different attitude of a gentleman in the mind of Eveline, ultimately pushes her to move to another paradise. Eveline believes that it is going to be kind of a paradigm shift of her life. Okay, it's going to be kind of a problem regarding a choice. So somehow or the other, if Eveline becomes one of the examples of Irish, otherwise Dublin youth, how she is paralyzed in getting a choice of her life is presented throughout the story. You find your hard life, you find your anticipated life, expected life, but you in the middle, you are unable to decide between these two. What ultimately happens is that you decide your stagnation might be much better than rather moving forward. It's quite kind of a different rather decision. Some people say it's kind of brainy decision. This is little applicable to Othello as well. In Othello's, Desdemona's decision in deciding whether it should be father or Othello. That dilemma that she had, and ultimately she says, I have kind of divided duty. I have a divided duty. father, you took me up to this level, and my husband would take me as a responsibility. So we find a lot of similarities in this, right? We find a lot of similarities, and you found it in Kusuma's character as well. Kusuma too got entangled between two worlds, right? She got entrapped in two worlds, like uh, listening to what Lokunanda says, or marrying the person that she decided. So ultimately, that she got stagnated. Okay, there also we find kind of politic exercised in that particular context. Why Kusuma was unable, why Kusuma was paralyzed, why Eveline was paralyzed. So the story is, we don't find a very complex plot in this, right? We don't get very complex plot. Plot is very, plot is very short. Suppose that you become a storyteller. If someone asks, what is the story? Can you tell me the story? You won't enjoy telling that because you find only very few lines, right? We can't rather chew it and, give it in a kind of beautiful manner like a fairy tale. But the story, even though it is very simple, very rather concise and all, it has a lot to think. That is why it has become kind of world famous story. Name of the character, name of the story. I usually invite you to think about the name of the text and study that name of the text in an intense manner. Always the name of a book, name of a poem, title of the book, title of a poem, title of a short story or whatever, they are very important. They are like, kind of the front door to a house. You have to open that to enter. So think about that. Why it is Eveline? Why it is Eveline? You can just go through. You can just type on Google the name and you can type the term etymology. You can find the root of that term. So I have already given the sources as well, how I found this information. Eve for evening, how it becomes kind of a motive in the story. Always we find that the writer reminds us that it is evening. The story starts in the evening, runs up to evening, and Eveline's decision is to be executed in the evening. Okay, Eveline, sometimes people call it Eveline as well, but pardon me, this is the way that I used to call it Eveline. So Eveline or Eveline. So it's almost connected to the term Eve. So there's kind of a definition of sunset and darkness, somewhere twilight. We call that twilight. Then Eveline has another definition. It can be life and it can be animal as well. So this, of course, I found as one of the important definitions because if we refer to the last stage of the story, we find her face was like an animal, right? Helpless animal. So it tells us something. Perhaps the writer intended to rather express that particular idea through the name as well. All right, because ultimately she was like a helpless animal. Who is an animal? You can just imagine. Animal is, we usually consider human is better than animals, but ultimately that her condition is downgraded up to that. Perhaps she has no choice in front of these rather superior human categories. Okay, she acts as a different category: woman, animal, something like that. Then there's a biblical reference as well, biblical allusion as well. What is that? Eve, Adam and Eve, the first man, first woman concept in Genesis. It can be Eve as well. All these are connected to woman. All these microcosmically suggest about the micropolitics you find between genders. All these you find that ultimately she suffers than he. So think about that area. And again, what is the reason? The story's name is given as Eveline only. It's only one word. It is not Eveline Hill. It is Eveline only. Why? What can be the reason writers suggest the first name only? as the topic of the story. Can there be any reason? Basically, we can assume that the first name is your specific identity. Your second name is the identity you get from the family, from your heritage, from your air. This is nicely explaining Tess of the Abbeville's. How Tess is entrapped between D'Urberville identity and D'Urberville identity. How ultimately that she becomes confused. So we have to note that why it is Eveline only. Is it kind of a disconnection from the society? Can it be a disconnection from that particular Irish Dublin culture? She as an individual entity, she as an entity which ultimately becomes victimized as an individual. It's kind of a very important thing to think. Yeah, Eveline as an individual girl, it gives sense of isolation. It gives sense of disconnection from the rest of the family. You don't get the surname. You don't get the kind of supportive name. You're not supported with the heritage. So you have to amalgamate all and think about that. I don't know whether there's a question connected to the topic and analyze that topic. I don't think that in A-levels you would get a question like that. But this tells us a lot about writer's intention of writing, otherwise designing Eveline's character, design the name of the story as well. Okay. Setting. Specifically, these are important. It happens in Europe, Ireland, and think about Europe and Ireland and how traditional they had been. And Ireland had been the connection to the UK, Britain, sorry, how the control of UK exercised in Ireland, how they emancipated for freedom, how Irish people got morally paralyzed. And we have kind of a suggestion regarding these particular interrelated connections between British and Ireland. I need you to read more about that. Especially the story is centered in Dublin, and Dublin is a coastal city. And why it is a coastal city? Often a coastal city has freedom to go out and freedom to come in. Exit and entrance to that area is it is given more options rather than land option. There is sea as well. You can be connected to other countries with this coastal entrance and exit. Okay, it's a port city as well. It is supported more, so it is well connected to other countries. So you have more avenues to go and come, exit and entrance. So just think about this. But you are stagnated. All the doors are open, but you are stagnated. It is very ironic in suggestion, right? Then we move on to the floating population expressed by the writer in the story. What is a floating population? Floating population. Now, suppose that you are living in a rural area. If you study the demography during a whole week, like, you notice a set of people that you encounter daily and they're familiar with you. In the morning, one woman walks. Every day we find that woman walks. And next day, next hour, another person moves from this place to the other. Sounds you hear, all these are very similar, almost similar. But if you rather count Colombo, and if you rather keep a notebook and stay in Colombo to mark people, it takes kind of troublesome. It makes you kind of confused, right? You find a lot of people from different arenas. They're quite different from each other. You experience that one person is different from the other. And one day this person, next day completely a different person, right? That floating, that changing picture of that particular area is very important to study, because Colombo is a center. We find a lot of exits and entrances. Now we can find it in Gaul as well. Sometimes Gaul has a port. We often find different sort of people on the road, different races, different characters, different types of people. But next day, when we walk in the Marine Drive, we don't find the same people there. We find totally different set of people. This actually, what is the reason this suggestion is done by Joyce? This floating population does not give you kind of familiarity. We don't identify characters. We don't sometimes associate with the characters with kind of firm belief. Sometimes they are not rather friends, they are not relations, they are somebody else. So when associating strangers, you get kind of different attitude. And again, you get kind of dilemma as well when walking in a town like that. If these people are familiar, you say morning, good morning to everybody, and you get kind of security as well. But when the particular picture changes always, you get kind of sense of strangeness always. So that can be one reason that writer includes a floating population, otherwise selects Dublin as the setting, and he keeps Eveline, the fragile character in a society like that. We measure how she responds to that population. This is very commonly identified in the boarding house. The boarding house is a very good example of floating population. People come to boarding house, they don't stay there, they don't retain for a long time, they leave, and a girl who is a flirt, expressed by Joyce, she's a flirt. How this girl would survive in this particular floating population is measured in that story. Then I move to the next. Dublins are curious about, yes, little spelling mistake. Dublins are curious about others' business. When you read about Dublin, you get kind of a quoted statement. Everyone knows every other's business. Everyone is curious about what happens in the next door. They're curious about what's going on. Sometimes in a society like that, getting an individual decision is quite hard. Example, you feel like marrying a black American person, black person, like in Desdemona's decision to marry Othello. Okay. When others are curious about your step, sometimes you will be paralyzed with their next reaction, which happens to Desdemona as well in Othello. Otherwise, I always believe if Desdemona and Othello are removed from that setting and put into an island, like they would be happier. We all know that relationships and even individual psychologies are always affected by the society's decisions. Okay, then paralysis of youth psychology is one of the more important factors that you have to think about. It can be one question area as well. How paralysis takes place in youth. In our syllabus, you find a lot of examples of that nature. You can get back to Akunna. You can take Kusuma, Eveline, and what about Maggie? On the other hand, we can think about Dee as well. And what about the other characters? So think about all these. How especially woman characters we find in the story are much paralyzed by the society's decisions. Then microcosm of Dublin. Dubliners express about the microcosm of the Dublin city. Okay. I don't know whether you know the term microcosm. In Dubliners, in the collection, you find it's kind of micro example of macro Dublin city. Okay, in Dubliners, you find single mothers. Sorry, in Dubliners collection, in stories we find Joyce's stories, we find single mothers. In Dublin city, we get single mothers, drunkards, morally paralyzed girls in the macro example as well. So it's again another good research area. Take Eveline again and think about the facets I suggested: socio-economic, political, interpersonal, and intrapersonal facets, and pick them and write them. And you can find how well the writer creates these characters, relationships, and all these, having the idea, this little story can be a good example for that big society. It's a micro example of that bigger society. Okay. Characters. We find Eveline as a central character, Father Frank as characters who directly involved in molding Eveline's character. They might be acting as major characters because they build Eveline's character there actually. Then Mother, whose absence marks strong presence in the story. So we know that in certain stories, like the very same example is there in the Glass Menagerie as well. In the Glass Menagerie, you don't find the father's character on the stage, but his absence marks a very strong presence. Think about such characters, especially Mother's character is such. Then brothers, even though one is dead, one is living. Okay, their appearance, their influence on the central character should be noted. And doubliness, all the others can be categorized as doubliness. If you take Eveline, we discussed much about Eveline, but symbolically you can think about Eveline's character as a psychologically paralyzed, therefore physically stagnated girl who is unable to exercise her will in Dublin city. She expresses a character like that. Then father represents patriarch, male dominance, chauvinistic male. And sometimes we find he's a racist as well. When the comments that he gives about the other races, like damned Italians and all, we find that he is egoistic and he believes that what he does is correct from one generation to the other as well. So he does the same to the mother, does the same thing to the daughter as well. Some people say that we can rather justify father's character because there's kind of biased appearance in the narration. We mostly focus on Eveline's character rather than focusing on the father in this narration. There can be a story to father's character as well. That is what we call thinking about multiple perspectives in a story. There are in certain places, the narrator tells that father had been good up to a certain point. All of a sudden, the father becomes a totally different person. Can there be any reason behind that? So the story does not allow us to think about that in an intensified manner, because the writer's focus is more towards Eveline, not about the elder, but about the younger. As we discussed, the writer Joyce focuses more about the stagnation and paralysis of youth in the collection, much about youth in the collection, much about women in the collection. Okay, so then father's role should be examined very importantly. Then Frank. Then father's and Frank's characters are juxtaposed. Eveline in the middle, father and Frank. Eveline's past and the present and the future. All these, three dimensions of time are characterized by these two characters. Example, or rather defined by these characters. Example, the life of father when she was a child had a happy life, and when she grew up, you find the father becomes the oppressor of the mother and even the daughter, and the father makes the situation so worse to women and even to boys. But here we find the oppression is felt more to boys rather than girls rather than boys. It is said in the story. When it comes to Frank gives much more. Frank gives a contrast, the juxtaposition. When you juxtapose, when you put, set side by side Frank's and father's character, Frank is the expected character, emancipated character, used to live in Eveline's mind. So then, when you are in a kind of now suppose that we are expecting kind of Diyasen Kumara to Sri Lanka. Okay, why do we have kind of emancipation about a ruler in Sri Lanka? Then if you find a ruler like that, he has come. So we are so happy about that. Okay, so then we juxtapose the existing one and the new one. So Frank has much to do in the story, even though he appears very little in the story. He presents us with the juxtaposition to father, presents us as kind of a character foil, opposite character to the father's role. Even though male, we find Frank's character acts as a totally different male in that particular category, male gender. He's from another country and he's a sailor. Okay? He's a sailor in the sense that he's not stagnated. And we know that water presents us with kind of a motive in the story. Water, and he's from Argentina. Argentina and Ireland are separated in the water channel from a huge mass of water anyway. So he knows world. He has been to world. He has experienced world. He has rather experienced the adventure of the world. Such notions contradict stagnated Eveline. That should be noted. Similar experiences there in connection to Desdemona's character. How Desdemona is stagnated in that particular strict society, strict decorum of Venice, and how she identifies that world is much of a bigger place rather than she rather experiences through the heroic adventure that Othello presents at her home. She falls in love with that particular adventure. What is that, symbolically? She experiences that as kind of a different but adventurous one. So she loves it. So it might be the reason that Eveline falls in love with Frank as well. Might be the reason, right? Okay, so think about Frank's character as one of the important characters. And think about the term Frank. Frank expression. Frank means earnest, genuine. So there are a lot of arguments regarding the term Frank. The term Frank can be ironic as well. He might not be frank. Okay, that might be the reason why ultimately Eveline takes a decision not to go with Frank. Okay, the term father ultimately the character father makes the term father ironic, so that Eveline might think the term Frank might also create kind of ironic figure when she's gone to Argentina, because Argentina is quite a far away place. But as a practice, if you just research, Irish people had kind of a connection with Argentina. They started kind of living in Argentina. Okay, that might be the reason that Joyce takes Argentina as one example. Otherwise, it can be the distance between Argentina and Ireland, right? So that it can intensify the serious decision of Eveline to run away with Frank to such a long area. Okay. Then the next character, mother, matriarch in the family. When mother was there, things were smooth. Things were going on normally. And matriarch, how this gender politics is presented between father and mother, are presented through the character mother as well. She presents us with woman, a character of woman gender, which is suppressed by the male dominance and continuation of male dominance from mother to Eveline can also be suggested in the story. Brothers, siblings, and basically we know that earnest, that there's also kind of earnest expression in that term earnest. One dies and there's another one who is away. This actually shows how Eveline's attempt to take care of these two brothers becomes in vain. Now she's alone. She's left alone. There is no one around to save her from the father's violence. But she dedicated her life to bring up the family. Okay, one brother is dead. Her attempt is in vain. The other brother is away, and he's not rather thinking about the victimization of Eveline or else the family as well. He's connected to religion. Okay, religion, but that religion is presented as kind of business there, right? Now in the story, we find Catholic wine merchants and flower deco business connected to church. So suppose that you sell flowers in front of a temple, that is not religion, right? That is connected to religion and commercial a commercial facet of the society. Now, when you go to certain Devala areas, you find that Pujavati, Vikunameka, that has kind of a commercial aspect in it. So perhaps Joyce's attitude regarding religion might be the reason that these sort of expressions are included in the story. Then rest of the people are Dubliners. We find co-workers of Eveline's working place, how they invite Eveline to think differently, appear differently, okay, and how they perhaps force Eveline to be different. Can be an expression of the societal expression, societal influence on a young individual in this society. The story in a nutshell. This is something important. If you think about the structure, this is something really important. Flipping back and forth between past, present, and future. Flipping back and forth. Okay, what do you mean by flipping back and forth? In the story, we don't find the character retains at the window, focusing on one thing, right? She's sitting by the window, but she flips back to past, gathers information and she starts observing outside the window. And again, she goes to past. And after that, in the latter part of the story, she starts thinking about Frank. It's about the possible future that she's going to encounter. Again, I invite you to think about this. Walking to past, staying at the window and looking out the window, and thinking about the possible future. These are the three dimensions we find in the story: past, present, and the future. So story appears little complex because of this combination. Sometimes using flashback and flash forward, the writer walks back and forth without giving further notice, without giving kind of emphasis that I changed my time. There is no mentioning about that. Usually we know that a lot of time phrases are used by writers to indicate now I'm in the present, now I'm in the past, now I'm in the future. Like without that use of tenses and use of ideas and attitudes of the character, the narrator, the writer presents now I'm in the past, now present, now it is the possible future, possible and expected future of the character. Think about that structure. This is the beginning of the story. She sat at the window. And when you start rather thinking about this in beginning, you find the lack of movement is experienced by the reader. She sat and watching, and evening is coming and all are there. And again, perhaps unpleasant setting is also created with the cretonne and the dust. Usually we believe that dust is for destruction. Yeah, that is there. But in the story, have you noted? We noted dust as a motif. Dust appears and disappears, appears and disappears. We all know, I have already read criticisms regarding this. Dust is for destruction. Dust is to show something has come to dust. But it goes beyond that. Have we noted she expresses at one place, I don't know from where this dust has come. Okay. Dust comes, dust covers the area. There we find kind of a very ironic suggestion. Even dust moves from this place to the other. Even though you clean, the dust comes. Dust is not stagnated, it floats. However, what about Eveline? Eveline's case is worse case scenario than dust. She's stagnated. So think about the use of dust as a motif. And in the next one, you find how the situation of the area in the past changes. Example, how she used to play with the youth, I mean, children in the Dublin, in the particular area, and she goes on a reverie. She's a little bit nostalgic about her past. Why do we become nostalgic? We become nostalgic when we love that past. So when we are not really happy with our present, only we become nostalgic. I'm not happy now. Now, for example, now I think about nostalgic. I'm sorry. I think about past Sri Lanka. Okay, I talk to my children. Yeah, this had been Sri Lanka. So when I rather refer to back, I mean, past of Sri Lanka, I get kind of animation on my face because I'm so happy about that. So Eveline too such pleasures being in past. She had kind of beautiful past with the surrounding, with and even the father and mother as well, having kind of complete family that she really enjoyed the life in that particular family. And again, we find in the latter part of that recollection, father comes with a black thorn stick. This black thorn stick is also very symbolic. It gives kind of control, rude control of Irish adult. Usually, we know that black thorn sticks are used by traditional people. If you just search, you find a lot of information about that. It can be kind of a control suggested over there with sticks. This was there in the house of Bernard Alba. Mothers came to display the control. Okay. So next step. Read it a little. Okay, home. I always, suggest my students to become practical in coding. Some students have kind of a belief that you have to write long quotations to earn a lot of marks. Even though you write a long quotation, if it is not relevant to the answer, examiner would not be impressed. So the term home is a very good quotation for you to think. The term home. Now we find that she refers to this particular term home in two different sets, like home in the past, home that she anticipates with Frank. The term home is not house. Okay, you have to think about that as well. Think about that connotation. Home is not house. She has kind of an kind of expectation that it should be kind of warm home. The term home, and when she examined this home that she used to live, you find a lot of dilapidated, destroyed, discolored, dusty things are there. The photograph and the broken harmonium. Broken harmonium is a suggestion of no music, produced in the house, no happiness perhaps. Usually in stories we find music is suggested in many ways. Sometimes you play music with a harmonium, otherwise you hear background music, otherwise the music comes outside. In this story we find music comes from outside, happiness comes from outside. Okay, so sometimes you see that the father stops her and asks that musician to move away. Okay, that he's rather worried about that music when it is coming through the doors. So no music is there, no happiness, no spirit is there in Eveline's home. So this actually tells about, this actually gives kind of an ironical attitude regarding the term home. Is this home? Is it home? Can we live in this? Is it supportive to psychology of people? And this gives kind of an attitude regarding religion as well. Do they follow religion Do they rather venerate the venerate? I mean, do they have kind of venerative feeling regarding the religion? Next quotation, she had consented to go away to leave her home was that wise? As I tell you at the beginning, punctuation is very important. Was that wise? Why this question? To whom this question is directed? This question is mostly directed to the reader. The reader starts thinking, was it wise? Should she go? Should she stay back? This parallelism is always there. Sometimes when a character in a movie is confused in front of a decision, when the reader is also confused. Reader starts sharing emotions with the character. Sometimes you start rather telling the character, even though it is not practical to tell the character in a movie to change the decision, you start, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. If you do that, you're going to be in trouble. So this is kind of a technique, right? So writers with these questions make the reader a part of the narration. Here we find that we think for Eveline. We take the responsibility of thinking for Eveline. What decision should be taken by her is supported by the narrator. I mean, sorry, the reader. She had consented to go away, had consented to go away, to leave her home. Was that wise? She was about to explore another life with Frank. Another life. And look at the suggestive use of the term exploring. Why do we explore? What do we explore? Exploring means it again gives kind of a suggestion. Here in Dublin, nothing to explore. Okay, perhaps you're familiar with all this. Otherwise, there is nothing to rather take as new. So you move away to explore. And she has some kind of attitude which is beyond love and relationship. It can be exploring another life. It's kind of that Eveline is excited to find another life. This is there with people who marry and go to another country. Excitement is there with the marriage, that's true. But there's kind of dual purpose in that marriage, right? Example, marrying and excitement is one. And what can be the other excitement? Experiencing another setting, another territory. That is also kind of an excitement. All right. There can be kind of dual, I mean, there can be multifaceted views regarding that. Sometimes you have kind of unpredictability when you marry an unknown person and going to another country. Sometimes you can have this sort of experience as well. You marry a known person and going to unknown. That is also problematic. I mean, this person would change when he's in unknown territory. This might be there with a woman mostly because I don't rather believe this, but women are considered to be fragile in emotions, especially when it comes to stories like this. So there can be kind of a dilemma in getting that decision. This can be rather problematic if the person is unknown and the territory you're visiting is unknown. Then you get serious dilemma, whether to go back, whether to stay, whether to go or whether to stay. So that anyway, she's going to take that risk. She's going to venture her life with Frank. And Frank was kind, manly, open-hearted. These are the expressions that you find how Frank is juxtaposed to the father. Now, at the beginning, Eveline was so overwhelmed to see that the father was very kind, right? He was funny and he wanted to make the children amused wearing the mother's bonnet and all. So it was the expectation of Eveline. Now she's disappointed. Okay, now she finds if Frank is kind, but father is not. Frank is manly, but not the father. This discusses about the outer appearance, otherwise whether he's handsome or not. And the term manly might be manly and man and animal as well. Okay, manly and woman කියන කතාවක් තියෙන්න පුළුවන්, but it's rather than it can be man and animal as well. And open-hearted, which father is not. These are certain terms that you have to think as quotations. And she was to go away with him by the night. Look at the language. Look at the language. We use past tense up to now. Here you also we find past tense, but there's kind of prediction done with the language. Was to go. Was to go. Okay, was to go. Bit of attitude of language is changed. To be his wife, to live with Buenos Aires, where he had home waiting for her. Look at the home in the previous one, and look at the home used in this one. That she is entrapped in two concepts of home. One, home created by the father, another home which is to be created by Frank. Her time was running, but she continued to sit by the window, leaning her head against the window curtain, inhaling the odor of dusty cretonne. The time was running. Look at the use of monosyllabic and disyllabic words. Her time was running out, but she continued. Likewise, you find uh, running time, the little time which you have to save, how it is suggested with this, with the chain of words given by the writer, should be noted. All right, and it gives kind of sense of urgency as well. Okay, and again the recurrent use of dust. Okay, and the dusty cretonne, the unpleasant environment is again presented. Now we find unpleasant environment, that she is to move from that to another pleasant environment with ozone in the sea, with the movement, adventure, and Argentina is a new territory. So I know that we all experience this sort of Argentina in life, right? We all expect to move and find life now. Nowadays in Sri Lanka, we all say it's better to leave Sri Lanka. How many of you have ever thought that there can be another Sri Lanka in some other countries as well? Sri Lankan condition can be there in other countries as well. We rather work with our predictions. We work with our assumptions. With all these, we show that we have anticipation of better life. So suppose that you think you and your family think of selling all the property, everything, and resign from the jobs your fathers and mothers lead these days, and you're about to leave for another country. The very day you would be getting a dilemma like this. Perhaps your mother, father would be having kind of a dilemma. Would we be doing good in that country? It's kind of common human feeling, universality of human feelings. This is not only connected to romance, right? It's about survival. So I say always, I believe that this is not only kind of a plan to find romance by Eveline. Can it be kind of escape plan as well? Let's think. So my question is here. End of the story. Otherwise, Frank and is Frank an escape button? Carefully examine the given quotation. She stood up in sudden impulse of terror. Escape. Escape with an exclamation mark. Look at that sentence type. I told you that, fragmented sentences are there. Why such sentences are used? We discussed that at the beginning. Stood up in a sudden impulse of terror. Impulse of terror. Okay. She must escape. Frank would save her. He would give her life, perhaps love too. Look at that sentence. Would imagine future. Would example, when if I went to schools, they would give life. So would is not the certainty. There is no sense of certainty. And is further elaborated with the term perhaps love. Is it love that she expects? Otherwise, with my escape plan, when I take this escape plan, love will also be there. The think about that. Perhaps love too. I need you to think about that one, right? If you get it as a context question, think about that specific area. Perhaps love too. So if you are a witty writer, you can use that quotation and a little quotation, perhaps love too within inverted commas. You can mold it into a nice answer. She wanted to live. What do you mean by living? Doesn't she live now? I need you to note down this. I need you to write down this. Living versus survival. Living versus survival. What she had been doing was survival. She was surviving in life. And with this plan that she's expecting, anticipating, living with Frank, living with full happiness, right? Inspiration, love. That life was kind of survival only, keeping the promise that she made for the mother and keep the family running, okay? Paralyzing your own needs, that you run others' needs, you rather fulfill others' needs. Was it living or just survival? So she emphasizes the fact that she needs to live now. And now I need to live. Then one might ask, suppose that you say, I want to live. Your mother, father might ask, why you're not living? You were living. No, I was not living. I was just surviving with all the commands and all, with all the kind of stagnated education in Sri Lanka, with this political chaos and all. I was surviving. I really want to live, and I want to live. Okay, I need you to apply all these theories into you, because Eveline is almost like you, young people. Okay, decisions, paralysis. Okay, sometimes the dead end that you're trapped in. What is a dead end? There is no progress. There is no coming back as well. So what has happened to Eveline at the end? She's trapped in a dead end. There is no escape. All right. Sometimes even though we plan to escape, the setting doesn't allow you. There is no escape plan. Otherwise, though there is an escape plan, there is no execution plan. You can't execute it. Okay, why should she be unhappy? No, she's talking about kind of rights of a young girl. She had a right to happiness. Yeah, it's true, right? You being born a human being, otherwise being an animal at least, you should be happy, right? Then look at this one. Frank would take her in his arms, fold her in his arms. He would save her. Look at the term save. Saving. What do you mean by saving? Saving from kind of a degenerated environment, corrupted, otherwise suppressed environment to a better environment. Then is he a lover? Is he the partner or a savior? Then my question again, I bounce it to you. Is it an escape plan? It's a very good question, right? Is it an escape plan? All right, then you can apply the same theory to Kusuma. Why Kusuma takes the decision to be with Lokunanda? Was it an escape plan? And what about Akunna? Akunna's decision with the white partner. Final decision, otherwise decisions that she takes in America, were the escape plans. Think about them, right? And again, we find kind of selfish motive under these as well. Look at the possessive pronouns she uses throughout. The writer uses throughout, like her arms, take her in his arms, right? So he would wrap me in love, wrap me, kind of giving, if it is not love, it is protection. Okay, so think about that. Is it kind of a love? Otherwise, is it to escape? This quotation is very important. Beauty as a very important term to remember. God, we surely know that God is to guide you. God has a plan. We all believe that God has kind of a plan connected to every human being. Then if God is there, God has to rather guide you. So Joyce's attitude regarding religion might be presented through this. At a situation of this nature, a helpless girl should be guided by God. So if it does not take place, that we have to question God. So this is kind of a presentation of attitude regarding religion as well in connection to Dublin and Dubliners. Thinking about the first plan, right? Coming back home. Could she still draw back after all he had done for her? Now, again, here we find that she has kind of a duty consciousness towards Frank as well. I don't feel like going with Frank, but he has done a lot to me. So can I take it back? Can I rather turn back to him because he has done a lot to me? Sometimes certain marriages happen on that ground. He's the one who rather treated me well, who helped me to get education, who helped me to build up myself as a woman. So how can I forget him? Is it love or a condition? So we question whether the relationship between Eveline and Frank can be considered a conditional relationship or an unconditional relationship. But think further. Okay, make my statement supportive, and I'll be sending more reading materials to you near future along with the videos. So think about that. The last of Eveline, the last point in the story. The final expression, it's like a helpless animal. Her eyes gave him no sign of love or farewell or recognition. This actually furthers the idea that she has already taken a decision to stay back. And again, we question whether there was love in her expression. Can you think of another similar situation we encountered in our short story syllabus? Final encounter between Apunna and the wife lover, wife partner, and lack of expression, bankrupt expression on the face of Apunna. And here also we find there is bankruptcy in emotions in the expression of the girl. Is it love? Whether it, was it escape plan? Was it for survival? Was it for love? So I have already seen in many of the answers, students highlight that Eveline loves Frank. Frank loves Eveline. So it's a little bit risky to jump into such conclusions, because literature is the way that we analyze it, right? The way that we look at that particular character and their perspectives. So some might say that, yeah, no, it's love. You have every right to say that. You have to prove it. This is how I prove my logic. Okay, but I had been proving my perspective. So again, don't ever think that what I say is the only perspective. What your teacher says is the only perspective. So in your literature syllabus, literature question papers, they expect your originality. Originality means that you should have your own argument. Sometimes you can oppose me, right? You can oppose me, you can rather perhaps nullify my answer. This cannot happen in that way, right? And again, I rather emphasize this fact. Make sure you do not become slaves in your answers. Like James Joyce is the best short story writer in the world. Eveline is the best short story. It's rather funny. Usually to use the term best, at least you have to read 3 short stories of James Joyce to say best, ne? Good, better, best. There's a comparison when you use the term best. Without that, you can't rather use the term best. You become a failure in that way. So you have to be a little logical, and you have to select what is correct and what is not by you. It is what we call originality. But again, breaking the boundaries and becoming totally original will also be a little risky. So you have to strike a balance, right? Your argument can be there. If you can prove it, do it, but stay on the moderate grounds as well at certain cases, because there are certain things we have to say anguru kalui. There can be reasons to say Anguru Sudhu as well. In logic, like you analyze them, but still the weight is there to say that Anguru Kalu. But we have to think about the majority's essence as well, but still you have the right to think about your own originality. Is this a fairy tale? It's a very nice question, right? So it can be one shared attitude as well in our short story syllabus. Is this a fairy tale? Just think about it. In Gothic novels, in fairy tales, we find huge houses like in The Beauty and the Beast, and kind of villain live in that, and a little girl, fragile little girl, entrapped under the rough hands of a man, and the prince. Okay, the prince comes, right? Who is that prince? Prince Handsome comes and safeguards the girl. All right, so that it's a fairy tale, right? In this story also we find certain fairy tale elements like the house of Eveline, and if we talk about whole Dublin as kind of rigid, otherwise society with rigid decorum, with people with stigma. Okay, and there lives a little girl, fragile, innocent girl, like Cinderella, most probably, and how she emancipates to run away with the prince, to end up kind of happily ever after story. So if you watch the newly made Cinderella, the new version of Cinderella, you find Cinderella is not happy with the traditional ending in that movie. She's happy, yes, she has got the prince, correct. But she ultimately, if you watch that, please, I recommend you to watch that. It's a kind of nice ending. In the last part, we find that Cinderella gets a decision to find her economic flourishment. She wants to become a fashion designer. She ultimately wants to achieve that. That's one option, right? Finding the prince and marrying him is one option. The second one is economic stability of. So it's kind of radical ending. Now think about Eveline as a fairy tale. Is it a fairy tale? Yeah, to a certain extent, right? We get kind of fairy tale elements because if Frank becomes a savior, like Unmada Chitra and Digagami, so he comes and kind of presents a different life, musical life, romantic life. If you read the story again, you find how Frank provides beautiful experience to Eveline, which are rather contrasting to the bleak experience that she always gets from the father, and how Frank becomes the Prince Charming in front of that rough demon-like father. Okay, kind of bleak society that she used to live, and to take to another land, far away land. Okay, but the story, the end of the story ultimately becomes ironic to the concept of a fairy tale. Her decision to stay back in that particular land that she used to live. So then, to a certain extent, yes, her decision ultimately makes kind of, I can't say it's a realistic decision, but it could be a decision of a teenager, perhaps, who is at the end of the teenage would take. Okay, so I take Eveline's decision is much more practical than a decision takes by a princess in front of Prince Charming's suggestion. So think about that nice question area as well. This concept is there in some other stories as well. Think about it. In the story, I'm rather reaching the latter part of the presentation. Use of flashback is noted because with the flashback, the story is restructured by the writer. Storyline is given from the exposition to rising action and the climax of the story. Climax is actually her decision and falling action, and conclusion is actually not suggested. It is in the latter part of the storyline, we find that it is little paralyzed. It is given as an open ending for us to think. So flashback is really creatively used in the story to flip back and forth from past, present to future. Then, yeah. Yeah, lack of action. Use of in the narrative, we find little action. And action is started at the latter part of on the very few paragraphs. We find action is initiated by Eveline to meet Frank and to leave with Frank. And in this narration, we find it is noted that the setting changes, and it at only one place we find that she starts sitting by the window. Window becomes an interface between inside and outside. I need you to note down that as well. In our stories, we find window becomes kind of an interface and symbolic at many places, like morning at the window. Inside and outside are separated in an interface, and cat in the rain, the wife, inside and outside separation. Otherwise, window to suggest the interface, like computer interface, outside and inside are separated with that screen. And think about that. And yeah, then nostalgia. This narrative is filled with nostalgia and dilemma as well, as kind of a technique, kind of a psychological perspective. Dilemma is there. A flat narrative. What is a flat narrative? There's no much of a complexity in the narrative. Okay, setting changes. We know that we are not even given the slightest description of this transition. I discussed this in an early slide. Time changes, but time change is not conspicuously suggested, slightly suggested. Sometimes the first timer would not understand the time shift. I must tell you, when I was reading this story for the first time, I had a kind of flat idea regarding the time dimension. I found it a little confusing at the beginning. I happened to read it 2 times, perhaps 3 times. Now, of course, after reading many times, I understood. I understand it. So it can be the difficulty in you as well, young people. That is why we say that reading a story many times is important, especially in connection to literature. You see the multiple perspectives when you read it more and more. Okay. Juxtaposition as one of the basic techniques. You have to think about that. How father and Frank are juxtaposed to give meanings. Man and woman are juxtaposed. Matriarch and patriarch are juxtaposed to mother and father. When she was under matriarch, that she was having kind of nice life, and patriarch is quite different and kind of rigid presented in the story. A juxtaposition of 3 dimensions, and it is suggestive of life then, life now, and life anticipated, and again stagnation and emancipation. Lack of movement and emancipation is a liberation. So juxtaposition in the story is creatively used. You may need this technique in analyzing context questions as well. Eveline has a microcosm of 1900 Ireland. The main character correlates to the situation of the whole society at that time. Eveline has a little example of the Dublin community, Dublin setting. So she represents a society with a character, a family concept regarding family, patriarch, matriarch, micropolitics, a woman and place of woman. And when you think about woman engaged in finding money, right? She earns money and she becomes kind of domestically occupied as well. So it gives about politics and economy as well, like micropolitics. Father doesn't work, brothers do not work, but girl has to work. And interpersonal relationships, how father-mother relationship is presented in Eveline. how father-daughter relationship, father-brother relationship, and Eveline and outsiders relationship. And ultimately, the most highlighted and most anticipated relationship is Eveline's and Frank's relationship. So when you examine them, uh, ultimately, Eveline decides to cut off the beautiful and anticipated relationship, showing that she paralyzes her will. Okay, then she decides to stay with the stagnated and bleak relationships that she used to live with. Then intrapersonal means psychological aspects. Most of the Dubliners, according to certain reading, uh, lead kind of corrupt, kind of bad, hard psychologies that Eveline shares. Mostly the dilemma, whether to stay back or move forward, and nostalgia about the lost beauty of life, and paralysis as one of the best and the main themes of the story. Psychological paralysis, which ultimately pushes you towards physical paralysis as well. You get stagnated, you don't find kind of active life. So with all these, we say that Eveline becomes one of the examples. The story Eveline becomes one of the microcosmic examples of the bigger Ireland, and Eveline's character Eveline too is a little example of the bigger Irish society. This story highlights about religion. I discuss this facet in early chapters as well. Belief of James Joyce regarding religion is presented in the story underlyingly. The attitudes regarding religion, attitudes regarding Catholicism, and the meaning of a religion. What is the meaning of a religion? Now, if Eveline suffers like this, religion should intervene. But if it does not happen, what is a why we should rather believe in a religion? Religion always should bring peaceful life to us, ultimately peaceful death. Then mother had kind of a meaningless phrase, there are sorrow, and by the end of everything there's pain. So she meaninglessly, rather repeats that particular phrase. But her life never met with peaceful death. She never died peacefully. So every Catholic, every Christian expects a peaceful death. We all expect that, right? But that was not the fate of Eveline's mother. She suffered even at the last moment. She had kind of burden in dying as well. Like that is the reason that she overburdens Eveline with kind of a promise: please take care of the family. So she died having a burden, so that she did not have a peaceful death. So if a peaceful death is not if that peace is not given to laymen by a religion, so Joyce questions why that religion, what is the use of that religion in a country. So, and again, that this further discusses about how religion uh, works out as kind of a business. Like in Action and Reaction, we discuss about institutionalized religion. Here also we find Catholic wine merchants in the boarding house. We find one character, the boy's character is connected to Catholic wine merchant. In churches, they use wine, and to sell them, there are merchants. Here we find, in Eveline, we find the church decorating business. The term church decorating business, church is decorated, that becomes a business. You might have seen when sermons, when masses happen, when wedding mass takes place, especially there are flower decors in a church, so that there are people who undertake that business. So religion is not rather presented as kind of a means of survival in the society, so that this might express us James Joyce's attitude, otherwise bleak attitude regarding religion, and he includes it in the collection Dubliners. So think about that. This can also be another question area. Spiritual paralysis and epiphany. Joyce's Eveline and the Boarding House. I suggested you to read the Boarding House. Here in both the stories, we find epiphany in women's lives. Epiphany means sudden realization is given. And spiritual paralysis and stagnation in Eveline in the time at the dawn of the modern era, modern life. How women are entrapped in social expectations and how they fear to change. That is also another very important factor under the patriarchal society. And basically, this is directed towards female adolescents. If you read The Boarding House, I again invite you to read The Boarding House before you go to the exam. It doesn't take much time to read that. Polly Mooney's character, an adolescent who is vulnerable in life in this particular society, and even though it is not very same to Eveline's character, we find a lot of similarities in connection to paralysis both the female adolescents face in life. However much the characters, the youth wants to change, the change is useless. By the end of the drama, by the end of the short story, Eveline, you realize how it becomes useless. Every attempt becomes useless. The tradition, the existing society is much more powerful to take you back. It's almost like a boomerang. Even though you throw the boomerang, it comes back to you. Your thoughts are also like that. Okay, example, you rather want the freedom like a boomerang, but it doesn't retain at the new setting. It comes back to the exact location that you used to throw that. And again, these stories tell us how women are paralyzed when a man is not there. The best example is Eveline's emancipation takes place connected to Frank because Frank is a man. She stays at home because father is a man. She has kind of a dilemma whether without man, can I survive? It has been kind of grown like a prejudice in Eveline's mind. Negative feeling that can woman survive alone without a man? Can woman survive without a man? Can woman rather be protected without a man? There we find that how woman empowerment is misunderstood by the women in Dublin, otherwise in Ireland at that particular time. Okay, empowerment is not understood. So in The Boarding House, we find Mrs. Mooney's character becomes an empowered character. Okay, some or the other, there's a suggestion by James Joyce, empowered women should be there. So Mrs. Mooney becomes an empowered character. So here we find Eveline becomes paralyzed. She's not an empowered one. Techniques, as a summary, structure of the short story is important. Juxtaposition, stream of consciousness, important. Irony, we know irony is of three types. Verbal irony, situational irony, and dramatic irony are there. In this story, we find father's language becomes ironic. To give examples for verbal irony, please examine those words. And situational irony is kind of very strongly used in the story, even though on and off the writer tells us whatever it is, Eveline would not go. I too got a feeling with kind of sense of uncertainty of Eveline's character, Eveline would not go. We get kind of prior feeling regarding certain characters. Would she go? Wouldn't she go? I got a feeling that she wouldn't go. But generally, we expect Eveline to run away with Frank, but it does not take place. She rejects Frank. So that decision, that particular action creates situational irony. Otherwise, technically situational irony. And what about dramatic irony? Especially when it comes to the escape plan. Father doesn't know. Eveline knows it, Frank knows it, the reader knows it, but the father doesn't know that. So that father becomes a victimized under that particular plan, escape plan. There we find dramatic irony is used. We keep on thinking, what if the father knows? What if father comes to know? What if father comes here? We get suspense. And again, Eveline's affair, she started running with Frank at the beginning. Father didn't know that, but father came to know that in the latter part, and the situation was worse. So use of dramatic irony is also there in the story. Then very strong usage is there of imagery. You get visual imagery, you get auditory imagery, lot of very suggestive imagery like uh, the harmonium, the sound of harmonium, the piano. My memory is correct. The Italian place. I'm sorry about that. The horn of the weak horn of the ship. Such suggests us about weakness of the story. Then the olfactory imagery, dusty creton, dust, the ozone smell of the sea, and the surrounding, the stale, you know, degenerated sort of surrounding. Okay. Then tactile imagery, dust, and the iron railing, it was cold, and the coolness of outside when they were walking towards the sea, the sensation you get of the ozone breeze, and tactile imagery as well, perhaps the salty taste of the sea. Mostly we find the other imagery rather than, I'm sorry, very sorry about that, gustated imagery. We don't get much gustated imagery. On and off we get like alcohol and all these. Other than that, we find this stories richer in imagery. Then symbols, we discussed about them, especially characters become symbols. And yeah, dust, the ship, and Eveline's house, and the other houses, newly built houses, thorn of the father, sorry, the stick of the father, and epiphany. Use of epiphany is also kind of very strong technique. If you have questions, you can send me now. Otherwise, you can send them to the WhatsApp group. So officially, I'm going to announce the end of the workshop. And we are going to have, I'm going to send messages regarding the next short story and its discussion near future. Mostly be in touch with the messages we send. And if you have suggestions, if you have kind of complaints about the workshop, we are ready to accept all, because we also had kind of tough time in getting ready for this workshop, because it was not actually kind of comfortable time for all to work because of electricity problem and certain other problems reviving around. But we had a pure motive in serving you to find, I mean, give kind of comfortable experience in the examination. So going to wind up the session. If you have questions, you can direct them before I wind up. Thank you very much for the messages. If you have any questions, further questions, you can send them to the WhatsApp group. So you're going to get this video. So please share it as much as possible. As I always believe, literature students and teachers must be having kind of a good heart. If you are kind of wet-hearted sort of feelings, you can rather follow the subject nicely. So build up empathy, understanding others' feelings, and make sure that you understand others' feelings. You can get good passes when you understand the characters outside in the books. So your life will also be kind of a very beautiful one when you understand others. So guys, think about passing exams. Try to pass your life as well, because that has become one of the most important expectations in the modern world. Wish you all the best. Thank you very much.